So first, I'm going to talk about the social context of refugee children, in general, globally, and in particular, the Canadian context, because that is where the research takes place. And then I'm going to briefly touch on the theoretical context, which is an individual differences approach to acquisition. And then, not finally, but the main part of the talk will be talking about the studies that we have done looking at bilingual development of Syrian refugee who have recently arrived in Canada. So refugee children, refugee numbers of people who are refugees are the highest ever globally recorded since recording started to take place. And over half of the refugees in the world are children and youth. Child refugees in particular have their development at risk for a variety of reasons. Some of them are listed here. So first, displacement, so moving around from not just one country to the next, but often refugees, families and children moved from various places. And children experience this displacement and frequent transitions to their routines, experiences, etc., which is not healthy for early childhood development. Another very significant factor for child refugees is disrupted or no schooling. So because of war, displacement, and transitions, these children often don't have the number of years of schooling they would normally have for their age. And some of them have experienced no schooling at all for years on end. And in the Syrian context in particular, this is an acute problem. In 2014 in Syria, primary school enrollment was the second lowest in the world, and it has only slightly gone up since that time. Child refugees tend to have exposure to violence, to deprivation, which means food insecurity and inadequate shelter and housing, and to poverty. And poverty often in their transition period and continues when they resettle in a new country. They also have experiences with death of and separation from family members. So none of these things are all that great for kids' development. Studies have shown that child refugees have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression when compared to non-refugee children. And we know that mental health and well-being interferes with cognitive functioning, and cognitive functioning is something that is really important for language learning. So we can infer that mental health and well-being difficulties could also impede language acquisition. Now, with respect to existing research, well, we can conclude that from this sort of brief overview of the social context that bilingual acquisition for child refugees could be unique from child bilinguals from other kinds of backgrounds. But in terms of the existing research, the research on bilingual development, most studies do not differentiate between whether the migrant children in their studies are immigrants or refugees or expatriates or whatever different category you want. So we don't really have a good way of figuring out whether we don't really know whether, with the existing research, whether refugees have a particular unique trajectory in their bilingual acquisition. There's certainly research looking at refugee-associated risk factors in children and their development, but it has really examined language development. These studies are usually looking at school functioning, socioemotional development, and so on. Now, so turning to the Canadian context, since 2015, the Government of Canada launched a special resettlement program aimed at Syrian refugees from the Syrian civil war. And since then, 83,000 Syrian refugees have been resettled in Canada. And some of them are government-assisted refugees and some are privately sponsored refugees. So what is the difference between these two? Well, government-assisted refugees come in as UNHCR convention refugees, and they get very minimal support actually when they arrive in Canada. They get social assistance, a social worker to help them with their housing, and that's about it. But there's also a lot of privately sponsored refugees in Canada from the Syrian program. And these are where church groups or groups simply of individuals decide to sponsor a family. And the privately sponsored ones get much more wraparound support, because the groups that sponsor them continue to support them for years after they first arrive. Now, according to the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, there are certain characteristics among the refugees who have come here from Syria that are the most common. So the refugees who have come to Canada are mainly families with young children. That was part of the targeted program. These tend to be large families. These tend to be parents with low education and low professional skills. And most of the children have had interrupted schooling. This is the most common background of the refugees in Canada. And this contrasts quite a bit with some other European countries where the path to migration is a little bit different than through a government-sponsored settlement program. And the demographics of the refugee population, I know for looking at the research in, say, the Netherlands and Germany, is quite different. There are smaller families, parents with higher levels of education than in the Canadian cohort. So just a note about paths of migration to Canada and why refugees ought to be considered separately, especially in the Canadian context. So in terms of immigration in Canada, the majority of newcomers, which is our umbrella term for immigrants and refugees, the majority of these newcomers are actually in the immigrant class. And most of them are in the economic immigrant class, which is competitive points-based system. People apply and they get selected to come in on the basis of how competitive they are, whether they speak one of our official languages, whether they have professional qualifications and so forth. We also have an immigration class, which is family class, where if you are an immigrant and you're here and you become landed permanent resident or citizen, then you can sponsor a family member. So most of the immigrants in Canada are in this group. Now, refugees are definitely a minority of newcomers in Canada, and this is another distinction between Canada and some other countries where the majority of newcomers to the country tend to be refugees. The refugees in Canada are of two types: asylum seekers. So these are folks who arrive in Canada through their own means and then request asylum once they get here, or UNHCR convention refugees who are identified before they come to Canada, are resettled through government programs. And of course, the basis for deciding if they are refugees and will stay in Canada is humanitarian based and not based on competitive point system. Most of the refugees in Canada are UNHCR rather than asylum seekers. Part of that's got to do with our geography. People can't just come here as easily as they can other countries like in Europe and then request asylum once they get here. And another point I want to make is that Canada has targets for newcomers annually. This is also different from some other countries. So we actually set a plan for how many newcomers we want to attract every year. And we've been doing that since the 1980s. So Canada has accepted between 200 and 300,000 newcomers every year since the 1980s. And as a result, we're quite a diverse society. In the last census, one of the striking findings was that about 55% of Canadians speak a language at home regularly at home that is not an official language, so not French or English, 55%. So that's quite a hefty number. So just to bring a kind of a personal, sort of a personal nuance on this issue of refugee children and the difficulties that they experienced pre-migration, I'm just going to share something brief with you. And these are some excerpts from a project that we did in the mid to 20s. I don't know how to say that, to 20 knots. Anyway, I don't know how to say it, but this is around 2006. And we do semi-structured interviews and play sessions to elicit spontaneous speech. And this was a study with just newcomer children in general. So I want to kind of contrast what happens during this spontaneous speech between children with different paths to migration. So here's a little excerpt from a little girl who's from Taiwan. So the experimenter, a research assistant, would ask things like, can you tell me about your life before you came to Canada? Here this girl answered, we have a big house and I see my grandparents every day. They're early in their English learning, so they make errors in their English. And then the experimenter asks, so what do you like best about life in Canada? And the child answers, I like so-and-so, my teacher, she is so nice. I like wear my snow pants and slide. Okay, so kind of, charming, interesting little child perspectives on these things. And let's contrast this with a little boy who was also part of this study, who had a refugee background. It was from the Sudan. So here the experimenter asks, can you tell me about your life before you came to Canada? And he responds, I not want to talk about that. We were outside there. And then later in the interview, the experimenter asks, what do you like best about life in Canada? And he says, there's food here. So when you just put these side by side, you can see that this little boy, this 5-year-old boy, has experienced things in his short life that can be that could be quite traumatic and could be put him at risk for all aspects of his development. So now let's turn briefly to the theoretical context, or the individual differences approach, which is the approach taken to this research. So some of the questions that I'm frequently asked by parents, teachers, clinicians, doctors, and that researchers themselves ask are, why do some children learn a majority L2 faster than others? And why do some children speak their heritage L1 better than others? And knowing the answers to these questions is theoretically interesting. It's interesting to figure out why, because we know, bilingual researchers know, that this group of children, these children who speak 2 languages, are simply more diverse. They're more heterogeneous in their acquisition patterns than monolingual children. But knowing the answers to these questions is also important because, learning the majority L2 is important for the child's schooling in the host country, for their social inclusion in the host country. Continuing to speak the heritage L1 is also important for the child, for their socioemotional development, for their sense of identity, and for their family cohesion. So knowing the answers to these questions, both of them are important for research reasons, for knowledge reasons, and also for applied reasons. So how do we approach answering these questions? Well, I'll start with the bottom of this diagram is talking about first and second language acquisition rates, how fast they learn and their outcomes, how proficient they are at any given time. And I've just got vocabulary, morphosyntax here. I could have added narratives, phonology, etc., but I've just got 2 here as an example. Well, one of the ways in which a lot of research is focused is approaching this, looking at acquisition rates from the view of language properties of the target language, either the L1 or the L2, and looking at, some people are looking at frequency, like token frequency or type frequency or distributional consistency of different structures in the ambient input. People are also looking at complexity, syntactic complexity and semantic complexity. And this way you can predict what structures might be acquired earlier than others. But the thing is, this doesn't tell you why individual children might acquire the L1 and L2 faster or slower than others. So if you want to figure out the answer to the questions that posed above about why do certain children learn faster or speak better, their L1 or their L2, you need to look at the level of child level factors. So child level factors are individual difference factors. So children have different cognitive capacities, different memory and analytical reasoning capacities. They have different ages of acquisition when they come in contact with the 2 languages. They have differences that keep not only differences in static time, but also changing over time in the quantity and quality of the input they get in their 2 languages. And they also differ in terms of the broader, the sociocultural capital in their family environment, which is often indexed by maternal education. So this is what I'm focused on in my research, because not that language level factors are not interesting, they're really interesting, but I'm focused on the individual differences in children's rate and outcomes and development. So this is the level I'm looking at. So what are the theoretical implications of looking at things this way? Well, first of all, the assumption is that, or the presumption, variation in child level factors modulates the access to and therefore uptake of the language level factors and therefore drive acquisition. So they're definitely mechanisms for acquisition. Child level factors in this sense are a large group of different kinds of factors. So there's some internal to the child, some that have to do with family characteristics and family language interaction, and others to do with broader language environment factors. And all of these can be considered individual difference factors because they're all at the level of the child, whether they are external to the child or internal to the child. So these individual difference factors do index language learning resources and mechanisms that children use to drive acquisition forward in their first and second language. And we know that variation in these individual difference factors is more for bilinguals than monolinguals. There's just more factors on which they can vary, and they vary between their two languages and within their languages, and therefore an individual difference approach is important for us to understand bilingual acquisition. The last point I want to make about this is, from my perspective, the individual differences approach is relevant to both nativist and non-nativist approaches to acquisition. So whether you're thinking of children's acquisition in terms of whether they have access to universal grammar or not, or something like it, is all compatible with the idea that these child level factors will be modulating this process, as well as some other factors. Okay, so that's the background, the social context background, the Canadian context background, the theoretical context of the research. So now let's sort of go on to the research itself. So when the Canadian government announced the resettlement program in 2015, a bunch of researchers across Canada got together and we formed the Child and Youth Refugee Research Coalition. I have to say that this particular group of people was brought together and shepherded together by my old postdoc supervisor, Dr. Martha Crego. She was mainly responsible for making all of this happen. And this particular coalition is a broad-based coalition of health researchers, social workers, researchers into broad sort of big data number crunchers in sociology, and language acquisition researchers. So the subgroup within this larger group that I'm part of is this amazing group of colleagues here. And we've had a longitudinal study looking at various aspects of language literacy and well-being in Syrian refugee children. And this study is still ongoing. So here's just a bit of a glance of the aspects of the study that will give you an overview of the individual studies I'm going to be talking about. So all the families who participated in our study arrived post 2015. So they all arrived as a cohort as part of this new settlement program. Most of the families in our sample are government sponsored, which means they are not ones receiving the highest level of support for their settlement and integration into Canada. We have 133 children, and it's across 3 different cities. I think I didn't point that out so much, but yeah, this is a 3-site study: Edmonton, Waterloo, and Toronto. Right. We've been following them in the data that I'm going to be talking about from their sort of initial 1st to 3rd years of English L2 exposure. So they're at time 1 they've had like about 1.5 years of English. And then wave 3, which is our 3rd wave, is ongoing. We had to delay it a bit because of the pandemic. So the language measures, we have quite a detailed battery of language measures. I won't be going into a lot of detail about the individual measures in this talk, so I apologize in advance for people who are interested, but you'll see in the references at the end of the PDF, you can look up some of the studies to find out more details. So we're measuring vocabulary, we're measuring morphology and syntax, we have listening comprehension measures and narrative measures. We have literacy measures as well, but I won't be talking about them today. We have extensive background measures, and the data were mainly gathered through a questionnaire model, through interview questionnaires delivered as interviews. We have information on their current mental health and well-being of children and parents, detailed information on pre-migration experiences, parent education, and then various aspects of the current language input environment in the L1 and the L2 for the children. So this is the title of the talk, about factors contributing to successes and challenges in bilingual development. So I've sort of couched this in terms of risk and protective factors. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about what those are. So risk factors are child, family, and environment characteristics that are associated with challenges in developing one or both languages. And protective factors are kind of the flip side. So these are child, family, and environment factors that are associated with successes in developing one or both languages. Now, risk and protective factors can be the inverse of each other on a continuum, or they can be categorical. In this study, in the group of studies I'm talking about, we have conceived of them mostly on a continuum. So for example, parent education could be conceived of as high or low, a category, and high being protective and low being risk. But instead we've entered it because we've done regression modeling. Most of our factors are continuum. So it's like more education versus less education. So more education is more protective and less education is more risk. So first, I'll give you an overview of the characteristics of our particular sample before launching into talking about what the relationship is between these characteristics and children's actual language outcomes. So here's some basic level characteristics. So the average child at wave 1 was 9 years old. Our range was 6 to 13. And they've had about 1.5 years of English exposure. This is almost 2 English school years, because school years are 10 months in Canada. And this coincides very closely with their length of residency in Canada. Most of them started schooling really quickly after entering Canada. Now, I've got the red lines here because these are things that could be kind of risk factors or red flags, I guess. So if you look at the length of Arabic schooling that children have had in months, on average, it's 15 months. And when you think about the average age being 9 years and you work backwards, you realize that these children definitely have disrupted or interrupted education in their backgrounds. They do not have grade appropriate or age appropriate levels of schooling in their first language. The families in our sample, like the Canadian cohort in general, have large families. So the average number of children is 4 and a bit. 35% of our families have had refugee camp experience, but this is at the family level. We actually have 73 families because many of our children are siblings. So when we think in terms of the number of children, quite a fair number of our sample the children have had time in refugee camps. In order to get information about who speaks what to who at home, we used a rating scale questionnaire delivered as an interview, looking at input and output between different family members. And the lower scores mean more Arabic and higher scores mean more English. So this is the results for our sample at wave 1. So remember, they've been in Canada for about 1.5 years. Generally, you can see by the concentration of dots here at the bottom that these are Arabic dominant households. They are still speaking mostly Arabic with each other. However, we see here that input and output between older and younger siblings and the target child, we see more English starting to emerge in interaction among siblings. So there's quite a difference between what the parents are speaking with the children and what the children are speaking with each other already, even after just 1.5 years in the country. We also wanted to know about language-rich activities. So this is kind of tapping into the quality of their language experiences outside of school. So we have, again, a questionnaire model where we ask questions about various kinds of activities, literacy-based and oral-based, etc. And lower scores, lower ratings mean they don't engage very often, and higher scores mean they do engage very often. So what did we find for richness of the children's experiences outside school? Well, just generally speaking, the majority did not have rich environments in either language. They had like scores of 1 or 2 for just about everything in both languages. The richest kind of experiences they're getting are listening and speaking activities. As you can see, the density of the dots is a little bit more spread out along the scale. What we see is that more reading and writing activities happen in English than Arabic. This is not a surprise given their interrupted schooling in Arabic, but listening, speaking, playing with friends and extracurriculars are happening mostly in Arabic at Wave 1 and not in English. Extracurricular activities are very, very limited. These are large families. These are families living on social assistance, which means they're living essentially in poverty, and they can't afford or have the time to take all their kids to, soccer practice or dance lessons or so on. Most of the extracurriculars we see here are going to Quran study at the mosque. Now, before talking about our measure of mental health and well-being, I want to talk about sort of the underlying premise behind how the measure is structured. So mental health and well-being difficulties cause disruptions in executive functions, things like attention and control and behavioral regulation. They also cause disruptions in mood and in affect. So that's why we see difficulties like depression and anxiety and depression. Now, these disruptions in mood and affect and executive functions manifest in children is very much in terms of what we call internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So it's measuring these internalizing and externalizing behaviors that gets you a window onto whether the child is having mental health or well-being difficulties. The measurement we used to get at this was the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. So this is an instrument delivered to parents, and it has questions designed to get at whether the child is experiencing some externalizing behaviors, hyperactivity or conduct problems, or internalizing, which are emotional problems and peer problems. And sometimes things like emotional problems are somatized. So I've got an example here, often complains of headaches, stomach aches, or sickness. These are results for the well-being at Wave 1. We found no gender differences in our sample. We'll see that conduct, emotional problems, hyperactivity, and peer problems are in separate scales, and so is prosocial. Prosocial are positive behaviors, and of course, their high numbers are good, but high numbers for these other ones are bad. The red lines here indicate levels at which, if the child is experiencing these kind of behaviors above the red line, that could mean that there's clinically significant problems going on with that child. And as you can see in our sample, we've got a fair number of kids who have scored above the red lines. Parent education, as I mentioned in the Syrian cohort, the demographics across all of Canada tend toward lower education, and our sample is very much in line with that. We see both fathers and mothers' education is similar in the sense that the preponderant group are those that have only had primary school, and in this group, some have only had a few years of primary school only, so only had up to grade 3 or grade 4 or grade 5. But we also have some university educated parents. So that's good in a way because we have a range and we can look then at the impact of parental education on children's outcomes. Finally, parent fluency. We did a self-rated fluency measure in English. Newcomers to Canada do have access to government-sponsored English language training, and most of our parents in our study did access those programs, although some had to quit partway through, and mothers had less access than fathers, depending on childcare responsibilities. Generally speaking, at wave one, our parents, most of them indicated they had limited to somewhat fluent in English ability. So overall, as a group, they are not, no surprises there, but they are not super fluent in English at this point in their residency in Canada. So I just want to recap what I think the risk factors are that we've gained from our background data on our participants. So the kind of factors we're looking at in our studies for adversity, pre-migration adversity, so interrupted schooling, which we use the Arabic length of schooling measure, how much time they spent in a refugee camp. We look at the SDQ scores to see concurrent mental health or well-being difficulties. We also look at family size and low parent education, because large family and low parent education is a kind of a risk factor. Now, it's not particular or specific only to a refugee experience in the way that being in a refugee camp is, but because family size and parental education indexes social cultural capital and resources in the family in general, and because of the particular demographics of the Syrian group in Canada and how they are different from economic immigrant families, it does put them at, it is a risk factor for these children compared to their immigrant peers in Canada. So, what are the protective and risk factors in the bilingual development of refugee children, and how do they predict their abilities in L1 and L2? So I'm going to give you some highlights from 3 studies. Study 1 is actually a combination of 3 studies, and I'm just going to be giving you highlights here. So I'm not going to go on and talk about each one in painstaking detail from scratch. So we're going to be talking about a group of studies probing the differential contributions of these factors to the Arabic L1 versus the English L2, and at wave 1 and wave 2. Then we'll launch into a study that is really aimed at looking at the specific contribution of the mental health and well-being and adversity to children's English L2 development at wave 1. And finally, we'll talk about dual language profiles, so looking at the combo profiles of their 2 languages and looking at a method of trying to identify children who are most at risk for having low development in both of their languages. So here's the first study. Now, again, this is a combination of different papers. So the way in which we went about this was looking at, we use logistic or hierarchical mixed regression models. So at step 1, we added child internal factors like age, nonverbal reasoning, and in one study, we also added phonological memory. I've got age with a little asterisk here because when we're looking at Arabic, age is indexing the amount of time the child has been functionally monolingual in Arabic, which is, a plus for their heritage language, the strength of their heritage language abilities. Age, of course, for English is indexes their age of acquisition of the second language. So what sort of level of cognitive maturity they had when they first were exposed to their second language. Step 2, schooling, length of schooling in Arabic or English, depending on whether the outcome variable was Arabic or English. Then we looked at proximal home environment factors, things like sibling interaction, language use, frequency of language risk activities. And then step 4 was the mother's and father's education. This particular approach was taken looking for receptive vocabulary in both languages, inflectional morphology in English, and in Arabic, we had an inflectional derivation combo task because of the way Arabic is structured. And then we also had a sentence repetition task in each language. So what we found for English at wave 1 is that having an older age of arrival and superior cognitive abilities, more English schooling, more sibling interaction, richer English environment, higher maternal education, these all resulted in more proficient vocabulary, morphology, and syntax in the English L2 when we look across all these different linguistic subdomains. Now, when it came to Arabic, we saw something a little bit different. So older AOA, superior cognitive abilities, more Arabic schooling, and higher maternal education all contributed to more proficiency in vocabulary, morphology, and syntax in the Arabic L1. But one of the things that we sort of noted here is that the concurrent proximal environment factors, so who's speaking what to who at home, how much Arabic versus English input they're getting, and richness of activities. This didn't predict their Arabic at all, and it did predict their English. So we did wonder how this is going to play out in terms of their shift to English as their dominant language, which we're sure is going to happen at some point, and also how well they're going to maintain their Arabic, because these sort of day-to-day richness in speaking the language is what's going to keep the heritage language going. And in another study in this series, we looked at differential effects, not only across languages, but also across time. So we looked at wave 1 and wave 2. And for this study, we focused just on the sentence repetition task. So what we found in this study is that over time, these cognitive abilities, so nonverbal reasoning and phonological short-term memory, stable predictors of English L2 and Arabic L1 at wave 1 and wave 2. So these cognitive abilities are contributing to better advancement in the two languages and across time. But the other ones, we saw some differences across time. So having an older age of onset of English acquisition predicted more proficient syntax at the first wave in both languages. Okay, so it was good for both. The older kids were doing better. But then at wave 2, we only saw this effect for Arabic. And so what we see when we look more closely is that there is a steeper growth in English L2 for the younger than the older participants. So of course, the kids, their growth in English overall is steeper because their Arabic abilities are pretty strong. So English is going from 0 to somewhere. So you're going to see a steeper curve. However, the steepness of the curve is more prominent for the younger learners than the older learners. Okay? Which means they're really sailing ahead with their English more than the older ones. We also found that the interaction with siblings, which the extent to which this happened in English, predicted more proficient syntax in English at wave 1 and wave 2. So the more the siblings are speaking to each other, the better the English. Whether this is this is an association only, whether it's they speak more in English because they are more proficient in English, or whether that is the cause of the more proficiency in English, we can't really say. But the association is very strong and stable across time. However, what we found is that this interaction, as you would imagine, predicted less proficiency in Arabic at wave 2. So we're finding that this proximal home environment is less supportive of Arabic over time than it is of English. So overall, we found the children were still dominant at wave 2 in Arabic. They did better on the sentence repetition task in Arabic. However, the younger children and children who use more English with siblings, we think that we're going to see their dominant language shift to English by wave 3, but the data aren't in, and we'll have to wait for that. Okay, so let's look specifically at these risk factors, at the mental health and well-being and the pre-migration adversity factors. And in this study, we wanted to see, well, we know these other individual differences matter and they're predicting the kids' development. So how do these risk factors in particular stand up in the regression models if we put all the other factors in as well? Do they contribute uniquely to what we see going on with the kids? So for this particular study, we looked all our child, family, and environment factors. And then we looked at English L2 outcomes, because this study was focused on their L2 primarily. So we looked at vocabulary, which was PPBT. We looked at morphosyntax through the SRT, the COS litmus SRT. We looked at the English one. We adapted the English one a bit to Canadian English. We also adapted that one to Syrian Arabic. In the sentence repetition task, we have different structures, simple declaratives, but also passives, WH object questions, and different kinds of embedded clauses. So it increases in difficulty in the task. We have a listening comprehension task from the test of narrative language, where children have to listen to a short story and answer factual and inferential questions. Really important for global L2 proficiency as well as attention. Narrative production, so children had to tell a story based on pictures. And we use linear logistic mixed effects regression for our analyses, logistic or linear depended on what the actual score was from the language measure that we used. So I'm not going to show you the results for every language measure. I'm going to focus just on the morphosyntax, the SRT. So all of these factors emerged as significant predictors in the optimal model. So let's look at them. So these ones, English schooling, age, older age, sibling language, these are all the ones that we saw from the previous study. So of course they came out again as being significant. But importantly, we also see the risk factors come out as well. So time in refugee camp, so longer in refugee camp, more depressed scores on the task, lower mother's education, lower scores on the task, more disturbances to child mental health and well-being, more internalizing, externalizing behaviors, lower scores on the task, and a larger family, lower scores on the task. So overall, in this study across all the different measures, we found that more externalized, internalizing behaviors, longer time in camps, more children, family, and lower parent education predicted lower performance on these tasks when you combine across all of them, and they make a significant and additional contribution once we control for some of the other agent input factors that are common to all bilinguals. Final study here. So these are looking at dual language profiles at wave 1 and wave 2 and see ways in which we can identify children who are at risk. I'm just going to take a sip of water here. So for this task, this study, we combined the vocabulary in English and Arabic to create a dual language profile. And what we did to do that was to look at the vocabulary scores using K-cluster modeling at wave 1 and wave 2. So K-cluster modeling will tell you how many profiles you have in your data. And in theory, there can be 4 profiles. You can have low Arabic, low English, high Arabic, high English, low Arabic, high English, or high Arabic, low English. And then the step 2, we looked at the characteristics of the profiles yielded to see if we could identify what factors contribute to low Arabic, low English, which would help identify which children are at risk. So the K-cluster analysis yielded just 2 profiles. So we either had low Arabic, low English, or high Arabic, high English. And I think it's important to note that the length of second language exposure through schooling was the same for both of these profiles. When we did it again at wave 2, we still had only 2 profiles and very few children changed their profiles. So we see a stability over time in this low profile, which gives us an indication that these children are at risk. They're not just late bloomers. So we haven't done the regression modeling to work out the actual characteristics in a more sophisticated way, but I did want to share with you what we know for now. So these are the high performing, low performing groups and what their spread of characteristics are on different measures. So the high performing kids tend to be ones who arrived at an older age. And remember, this is for both languages, so high performing in both languages. The children who tend to do better are the high performing kids have more English richness at home. And remember that this is both Arabic and English. So it indicates that a richer English environment is also supporting their Arabic in an indirect way. Maternal education, no surprises there that the kids who are higher performing have mothers with higher education. The kids who are higher performing tended to have more schooling in Arabic before arriving in Canada. And again, what's interesting about this is also, these scores, these are also include both languages, English and Arabic. And finally, these are just trends, but when we see the modeling, we'll see how they play out. But the kids who are high performing tend to have fewer well-being difficulties, and they tend to come from smaller families. So overall, across the sort of studies 2 and 3, we see an emerging picture of what brings down children's ability in their Heritage L1 and their English L2 and what actually supports or brings it up. So we see that more pre-migration adversity, more well-being difficulties, lower maternal education, larger family, younger age of arrival, and impoverished home language environment brings down their bilingual development in both their languages, and the inverse of all these factors, so less pre-migration adversity, fewer well-being, higher maternal education, smaller family, etc., richer environments, brings up their abilities in both languages. So some sort of general conclusions. I think based on the first studies, the group of studies that I called study 1, I think what we see is that child, family, and environment factors modulate bilingual development differentially across languages and across time. And what is particularly important is that Arabic L1 is less supported by proximal environment factors than English L2, and this could be a red flag for how well they will maintain their heritage language over time for those who don't have very rich environments in Arabic. We also know from this research that bilingual development in child refugees is modulated by mental health and well-being and pre-migration adversity factors, and this is beyond the influence of the kind of individual factors we see common to all bilinguals. There are children who have a low dual language profile, and because this is stable across 3 years of residency, and it is associated with a greater density of risk factors, understanding the risk factors could help us predict which children are at risk and which children need more support. And overall, these child bilinguals from refugee backgrounds simply have more challenges to their bilingual development than bilingual children from other kinds of migrant backgrounds. So what are the implications? I think that first and foremost, we need more awareness among educators of the vulnerabilities in English language learning and for the heritage language maintenance. For children who are first generation refugees, teachers often think of English language learners as here in Canada, they'd be other L2 learners, other target languages in different countries, but tend to think of them just all as a block. Okay, they just have to, learn the target language, the language of schooling, and they're all just second language learners, but they aren't really. Some of them are more vulnerable than others, and they are probably going to have a different trajectory, and some of them will definitely need more support. I think this also has implications for referrals. So when teachers see kids who seem to be slow L2 learners, maybe they know they have low abilities in their first language, they seem to be struggling in school, etc. So this is where teachers might initiate referral, and then clinicians come into play. One thing to keep in mind is that the source of some of these problems in refugee children could be psychosocial factors. They could be mental health, well-being, adversity factors, and they might not indicate that the child has an inherent language disorder or an inherent learning disability. And so keeping an open mind as to what the factors are causing the child to show these problems is really important. And the final point I'd like to make is that, a lot of these things about the vulnerable children, these risk factors, we can't change. They're not modifiable. We can't really change mothers' education or the experiences they've had before they came to Canada or to another host country. But we can change their language environments. We can make them richer in both languages. But the important thing to remember about this is that really this greater support probably needs to come from somewhere in the community, schools, libraries, and probably not parents. And the reason why not parents is a lot of the parents in our study, and we've known from other studies, they might not be able to step up and engage in their children. They have a lot of stress due to their own mental health issues, the low income or poverty in which they're living, acculturation, their low education and perhaps low literacy levels. They have a lot of children to take care of in their families. And so, well-meaning teachers might say to families, oh, read to your children for such and such a time every night. But, for some families, that's just not possible. And so, don't give parents homework. Think of other ways to create richer environments for these children. This is something we can change, and it's evidence-based recommendation in the sense that we know research shows that this will help children develop stronger skills in both their L1 and their L2, which is ultimately what we want. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to this talk. If you want to know more, you can go to my website there. I've got some references pertinent to this talk. And this is a picture of our amazing language literacy and wellbeing project team at the U of A in 2020, the last time we were all together and could take a picture. Thank you.